Welcome to the Freak Show, fellow freaks.
I'm Matthew Brockmeyer,
And I'm Christa Carmen.
and this is,
Murder Coaster.
ladies and gentlemen, enter, if you dare, into the world of one of the worst monsters that has ever roamed the planet. Israel Keyes. We will never know just how many people Israel Keyes murdered. The FBI called him the most meticulous serial killer in American history. A truly terrifying beast, trained by the military, raised as a survivalist, proficient with any number of weapons and tactical gear. He killed men, women, young, old, all chosen at random, most thousands of miles away from each other, using kill kits he buried years earlier, full of guns, money, garrotes, ropes, and zip ties. Sometimes bringing along a camping stove he'd used to torture his victims. As he himself would say,
I take it to the next level. The sexual fantasies, the money, the adrenaline rush. Once you get started, there's nothing like it.
brace yourselves and prepare for one of the most shocking and horrifying tales in the history of true crime. The story of Israel Keyes.
Let's begin. Prologue. Monday, the 21st of February, 2012.
Good morning, Anchorage, Alaska. Currently 30 degrees and overcast outside the studio with a light snow falling. Still no sign of missing teenager Samantha Koenig. Please call the tip line if you have any information her family is worried sick. And now, back to our new metal rock blah.
When Israel Keyes returned home from a cruise with his 10-year-old daughter, he went to the storage shed behind his house to check on the corpse of the teenage girl he'd left there, stuffed in a cabinet and wrapped in a cocoon of sleeping bags and tarps. Just as he'd planned, she'd been completely frozen and was as fresh as she was when he'd left her.
Killing her had been on a whim. He'd never done something so daring right where he lived. Most of the murders and rapes he committed, he'd done thousands of miles away, where he was just a stranger passing through. But the rush of adrenaline taking her right there like that, right in public, was a rush he'd never experienced before.
She'd been working in a coffee stand, a little kiosk by the road, and he'd gotten it in his head it would be an easy place to rob, especially as it was hidden behind a 5-foot wall of snow. He'd recently purchased a tiny police scanner that fit right in his ear so he could monitor their activity, and was eager to try it out, to use it during the robbery of a coffee stand.
So he'd gone to the Common Grounds drive-through coffee stand just before closing and robbed it. Then, on an impulse, egged on by something in the night, the snow, the feeling of desolation caused by the storm, the way the streetlights glowed in the darkness, punctuated by the drifting white flakes, he simply decided to abduct the girl on an impulse.
He was leaving on a 2-week cruise with his daughter in the morning, literally hours away, which gave him a perfect alibi. And the excitement of doing something so bold was just too much. So he'd snatched her. He figured he'd quickly rape and kill her, then stash her body in his storage shed, and when he got back from the cruise, he'd put out a ransom demand to her family. Whenever Israel could make a few bucks off a random murder, he liked to do that. It added to the thrill, another form of degradation that fed his sadistic desires. Plus, he needed the cash for his lifestyle. It wasn't cheap, constantly flying around the country, driving to distant lands, burying caches of guns, ammunition, and zip ties in random places across the country.
It was freezing in the little metal storage shed, so he turned on a propane heater, which blasted warmth as he stretched out a large piece of plastic and rolled the body out onto it. She was frozen stiff, and he'd had to remove the doors of the cabinet just to get her out. He lifted her arms above her head, wrapped a rope around her wrist, tossed the end over a beam, and hauled her upwards, securing the rope to the wall.
As the body hung there, slowly thawing, he prepared a table, setting out everything he was going to need. All the supplies he'd recently purchased. Lipstick, foundation, eyeshadow, mascara, fishing line, curved industrial sewing needles, and a Polaroid camera.
When she was quote-unquote floppy, he laid her on the table and, giggling dementedly, had sex with her, and then set to work, making her appear as if she was still alive.
He braided her hair, just like his zealously religious mother braided hers, laughing to himself. He
was always laughing. It was a nervous habit. Sometimes he'd make little weird jokes. Other times he'd just laugh for no reason at all. His hero, Ted Bundy, did the same thing. Maybe a habit created out of trying to appear human, to hide his brokenness, as well as a response to the darkly absurd life he was living. Here he was, in a shed, with the corpse of a teenage girl he just had sex with, all while his own daughter was less than 50 feet away, watching cartoons in their house, eating cereal and getting ready for school, blissfully unaware of what her serial killer father was up to. You kind of had to laugh, didn't you?
Then there was a knock at the door of the shed. It was his daughter, wondering what he was doing, saying she was going to be late for school. He yelled out to her that he'd be right out to wait for him inside the house.
After taking his daughter to school, Israel, or Izzy as he was often known, returned to the storage shed in the corpse of Samantha Koenig. He studied her pale face. What is it that makes someone appear alive?
First, he'd have to apply a thick layer of foundation, as she turned a very pale blue, almost white. Dead white.
But after coating her in foundation, applying eyeshadow, lipstick, even mascara, she still just didn't look alive. Her muscles had all gone slack, making her expressionless. No amount of makeup was going to change that. As Keyes would later state in his confession to the FBI,
That's when I kind of gave up on, the mouth and stuff. I just decided to tape it. I taped it so that, it looked like her face had some texture to it, I guess. And then I was still having problems with her eyes, because there was no expression. And I tried super glue. That didn't work. Yeah, so I took the needles that I had. I had a big curved needle. I forgot what they call it, but I had that, and then I had that 10-pound test fishing line, and I sewed. Took the needle and went down through her brow, right between her eyebrows, and down, up, along her nose cartilage, under the skin, and came out, and then went back up along the same path. and did it again, and then pulled it tight, so it appeared she was clenching her eyes shut. And then I took a test picture, just to kind of, see what it was going to look like. And I put a little more makeup on her after that, and I already had her hair braided at that point.
Finally satisfied that he'd made her appear as alive-looking as possible, Israel faced another issue. He wanted to photograph her sitting up, but her head kept flopping around, so he was forced to hold her head up in the picture, including a newspaper he found in a dumpster from February 13th, a date that would show her alive long after her abduction, but also during a time when he'd still been on his cruise.
The pictures weren't perfect, but it would do. Just to make them more mysterious and hard to trace, he cut off the edges and scanned the image and printed it out on his printer as a photocopy.
He had Samantha's ATM card and the bank code, so he typed out a letter to her father on an old typewriter he'd picked up at a thrift store, telling him to deposit $30,000 in her bank account if he wanted to see her again. Then saying,
I may not use the card much in Alaska due to small population, but as I will be leaving soon, I will be using it all over. She did almost get away twice. Once on Tudor Road and once in the desert. Must be losing my touch.
He'd later say he was trying to hint that he'd taken her south into Mexico to be sold as a sex slave, hence the reference to the desert. And that reference would, in fact, give her family and friends hope that she might be alive in a different location.
He put the ransom note and the photocopies of the Polaroids into a Ziploc bag, careful to wear surgical gloves at all times, and drove out to Connors Bog Park and pinned the baggie to a bulletin board beneath a flyer for a missing dog named Albert. Then, using Samantha's phone, he texted her boyfriend. Connor Park, sign under picture of Albert. Ain't she purty?
A few days later, Keyes drove out to Matanuska Lake and built an ice fishing shack way out in the middle of the lake. Using a chainsaw, he cut an 8-foot by 8-foot hole in the thick ice, covered it with plywood, mounded the wood with snow to insulate it, and left.
Back home, as his daughter did her homework and his girlfriend cooked dinner, he sat alone in the back shed, listening to Slipknot, smoking cigars, and sipping wine as he dismembered the body of Samantha Koenig, using a utility knife to cut through the flesh and muscle, and an electric sawzall to saw through the bone, cutting off her head and arms, chopping her into pieces he could fit onto a tote he'd tied to a sled, and pulled out to his ice fishing shack the next day.
It took 3 days to complete the task. The first day, he disposed of her head and legs, dragging them out to the shack on his sled, weighing them down with lead weights, and dropping them into the icy abyss of the lake, where they fell over 40 feet down to the murky bottom.
He then went to a parent-teachers conference at his daughter's school, where she was being enrolled into the Gifted and Talented program.
He returned the next day, dumping more body parts, and the day after that, when the last of Samantha was weighted down and dropped into the black and icy depths of the lake, he cast his pole and went fishing, smoking a cigar. He caught a few small fish, brought them home, and pan-fried them.
Israel Keyes thought he was smarter than everyone, could cleverly get away with murder, and it was this ego that would see him caught. In many ways, he was the first modern serial killer to use the internet, to be tech-savvy. He'd research places on his computer, use GPS coordinates, and then, when going to them, be so careful as to dismantle his cell phone, take the battery out of it, so that it could not be traced or pinged, always paying in cash so as to leave no trail. But he stupidly thought using the ATM card of a missing person throughout Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas wouldn't leave an obvious trail that the FBI was smart enough to see, or that Texas Rangers, who took apprehending murderers very seriously for hundreds of years, wouldn't be all about finding him, which they quickly and easily did.
In custody, the FBI was stunned to find he had no rap sheet or criminal record. Nothing. Running his name in the FBI's internal database, it should show if he had ever even been mentioned in a police report anywhere in the United States. But there was nothing. He was like a ghost.
And though he'd served time in the military, he didn't even have a social security number or birth certificate. How can you be in the military and not have had a social security number or a birth certificate? Just who was this devious monster? Who was Israel Keyes?
Chapter 1. Little Izzy.
Songs over and over again, thinking one of these days I might find myself in the mirror at the mall at the consumer shelf.
Israel Keyes was born in the little Mormon town of Richmond, Utah, on January 7th, 1978, the second of 10 children.
His parents, Heidi and Jeff, both from Los Angeles, where they'd met through the LDS, the Church of the Latter-day Saints. Jeff had been living in Germany, where he'd been sent by the church to do his missionary work, and he'd just gotten back to America.
They were good, wholesome, God-fearing Mormons, and after marrying, they decided they wanted to raise their children in nature, far away from Los Angeles, a city of sin. So they moved to Utah.
Their first child, a daughter named America, was born at home, delivered by Jeff. And all 10 of their children will be birthed at home and delivered by Jeff. Jeff and Heidi didn't believe in hospitals or modern medicine. It went against their strict and increasingly bizarre religious beliefs. They were also strict anti-vaxxers. Neither Jeff or Heidi had ever been immunized, and neither were any of their 10 children.
They also didn't trust the government, and none of the children were given social security numbers or birth certificates, part of what Jeff saw as the number of the beast from Revelation.
We've talked about strange Mormon cults before, like on our Lori Vallow episode, how revelation from God was accepted as fact. Therefore, any bizarre thought you get in your head had to be real. And this weird little family definitely seemed to be falling into that mold. In fact, even the fellow Mormons in the town of Richmond saw the family as strange.
So the Keyes moved out to the wilds of Washington state, where they managed to scrape up enough money to purchase 160 acres on top of a mountain in Colville by the Canadian border. Here, 5,000 feet up into the mountains, surrounded by soaring fir trees, they could live off the land, free from the government and the prying eyes of neighbors. It would be a biblical paradise.
But there were no structures and no infrastructure of any kind, just raw, rugged, and mountainous land. So they rented a one-room cabin with no heat, plumbing, or electricity to live in while Jeff set to work building them a house. For 7 years, the family lived in this tiny off-grid cabin, Jeff working as an appliance repairman and general all-around handyman.
Israel grew up here, deep in the woods, with no television, no radio, no telephone, being forced to memorize passages of the Bible. For the kids, it wasn't the holy adventure it was for their parents. It was no fun at all. They wore hand-me-down clothes that were tattered and falling apart, and shoes that were too small, causing Israel's feet to be permanently disfigured.
And as the family grew, Heidi having a child seemingly every year or two, the family became dependent on Israel, the second eldest and oldest male, as a babysitter and homemaker, cooking and cleaning, sewing, even braiding his sister's hair.
With Jeff off either working, praying, or building their home, which included clearing the land, Israel was often seen as the man of the house, and all of Izzy's siblings both depended on him and adored him.
The tiny cabin grew so crowded that from April until November, Israel and his sisters would live outside in a tent, leaving the cabin to Heidi and the smaller children.
They grew vegetables and hunted. The children never saw a doctor or a dentist. Heidi treated them with herbs and oils, saying peppermint tea and a hot bath could cure any ailment. Which, sorry, I just have to comment because, I don't know, man. As a mom now of 4.5 years, I always start with peppermint tea and a hot bath, but, there's a lot of instances where that's just not enough. And these people, man, they always get me. A
part of it I like and I admire.
No, right, exactly.
Exactly. You know what I mean? They definitely took it too far in a weird direction.
So far.
And all the weird religious brainwashing stuff, it's just crazy. But Heidi was proud of her lifestyle, her lack of need for material things, her rugged individualism and nonconformity. It all, made her feel superior, raising her growing brood as God intended, deep in the forest and surrounded by nature, without the spiritual corruption of science, medicine, or the government.
The family was extremely religious, Jeff going out into the woods to pray every morning. But at some point, they gave up on the Book of Mormon and instead found a bizarre, incredibly racist and esoteric form of Christianity called British Israelism that was being taught at a local church called the Ark, which is still around and is now called Our Place Fellowship. Chapter 2: Crazy White People with Guns.
Spawned in England in the late 1800s, British Israelism taught that it was Northern Europeans, and not the Jews, who are the true chosen people written of in the Old Testament of the Bible.
This weird belief was spread in America by a radio preacher named Ted Armstrong in the 1920s and 30s, growing more and more racist, eventually coming to believe that Jews, in a plot with Satan, had stolen the claim of being God's chosen people as part of an evil scheme to oppress and cheat Aryans.
When the movement had reached a peak of racism and bigotry, they changed their name to the Christian Identity Movement. And this is the next in a long line of religious movements that the Keyes family became involved with. They'd gone from Mormons to racist survivalists who believed Jesus was British, or, as Israel would later call them,
crazy white people with guns.
By the 1970s and 1980s, eastern Washington and northern Idaho were considered the northwest frontier for the Christian Identity Movement. There were almost no minorities, and so much space that you could go out into the mountains and start your own community, live off the land, hunting and trapping, find your own way of life.
So at this point, Israel was now 12 years old and took a great interest in the militant and anti-Semitic Ark Church, befriending two brothers around his age who lived about a half-mile away, named Chevy and Cheyenne Kehoe.
Years later, these brothers would try to take down the United States government with an Aryan People's Republic militia and go on a deadly crime spree, including wild shootouts with the police. And Chevy would receive 3 life sentences for kidnapping, torture, and murder. Chevy is also rumored to have assisted Timothy McVeigh in the Oklahoma City bombing.
Wow, that's wild. Right. Chevy and Cheyenne were from a big family, just like Israel, having 6 siblings. They too were homeschooled and taught racist theories from the Bible and lived off-grid, hunting for meat and growing their own vegetables. Their father was openly planning for a coming race war, and the entire family was heavily armed, considering guns part of God's plan.
And the Kehoe brothers knew everything about guns, how to take them apart, how to clean them, how to hide them, how to steal them, how to sell them on the black market. All of which young Israel found utterly fascinating.
Izzy became absolutely obsessed with guns, learning all the different makes and models, collecting guns and ammo magazines. He began breaking into homes with the Kehoe brothers to steal guns, going to underground gun swaps and offloading them.
Israel also began displaying sociopathic tendencies. He'd take his younger sister Charity out with him, and they'd vandalize homes, break into them, rob them. Israel began developing a pyromania and starting fires in the forest. But as he says about his times with his sister Charity,
she talked too much about it. People found out about some of the stuff I did, like my parents and parents of other kids who would hang out with me. So I quit doing things with her.
he became sadistic, taking pleasure in torturing animals, realizing he was different than the other children. As he says,
there was a cat of ours that was always getting into the trash. It was my sister's, and I told her if that cat gets into the trash again, I'm going to kill it. So with my sister and some other kids, I took the cat out into the woods. And I took a piece of parachute cord and tied it to a tree. And I shot the cat in the stomach. And it ran around and around the tree and then crashed into the tree and started vomiting. I actually kind of laughed a little because of the way it was running around the tree. But I looked at this kid that was my age and he was throwing up, kind of traumatized. And he told his dad about it, and of course his dad talked to my parents about it, and that was pretty much the last time anyone went into the woods with me.
We can clearly see a blooming sociopath and sadist, and we also see his weird laugh coming to play. How he's amused at what would horrify and disgust a normal person, giggling at the pain and suffering of a helpless animal, unable to have empathy or sympathy for another living thing.
Israel noticed something else at this point that seemed to set him apart from the other kids. He was equally sexually attracted to both men and women. He was bisexual, another thing that would make him unique as a serial killer and make his victim pool so diverse. Of course, being raised in a deeply religious, conservative, and violently racist community, he kept his attraction to men a guarded secret.
Jeff finally finished building their house. It took 7 years, and the family moved in. There was a generator for electricity, a propane oven and stove, even propane lights. But interestingly, no water heater. They still boiled water in the fireplace, which is totally weird to me. A propane hot water heater is like very cheap, easy to install, and usually one of the first things you get when you're living off grid. I mean, come on, working all day in the sun, hot showers are a must, in my opinion. Takes no time to install one of those things.
But Israel did not move into the home with the rest of the family. Israel had learned the basics of construction working with his father and other members of the Ark Church, and when he was 15, Israel built his own cabin, about a mile from his parents in the wilds of the National Forest, and moved in there instead.
And at this point, Izzy was just obsessed with hunting animals, saying,
I would hunt anything with a heartbeat.
He trained himself to sit still for hours on end, to camouflage himself expertly, to listen for the smallest of sounds, to even smell an approaching animal. He was an expert in dressing and butchering deer, providing meat for his hungry family.
But out there in the woods, completely camouflaged, attuned to every moment, Izzy would sometimes spot some hiker and stalk them as if they were prey, fantasizing about how easy it would be to make them disappear forever after he'd raped and tortured them. As he said, I can remember doing that from the time I was 13, 14 years old.
Chapter 3. Izzy Gets Busted.
When Izzy was 16 in 1994, he was arrested for shoplifting and given community service.
Jeff and Heidi were pissed, and the strict religious couple searched Izzy's cabin, finding guns he'd stolen from their neighbors. He was forced to return the guns, and furthermore to chop firewood for the families he'd robbed from to make amends. And he was no longer allowed to live alone in his cabin. And Izzy actually had a girlfriend at this point, but he was no longer allowed to see her, and was only allowed to communicate with her through letters, which he did, and would continue to do, writing her often.
Israel thought the whole thing was incredibly hypocritical. He was a poacher hunting deer out of season with no license, completely illegal, but his parents encouraged this as it put food on the table. Why was shoplifting any worse?
Then, after the siege of the Branch Davidians in Waco, Texas, that ended up with 80 people dead, Jeff began to pull away from the Ark Church. And seeing his father's religious fervor seeming to sway, Israel confided to his parents that he no longer believed in organized religion and was even questioning the very existence of God.
He thought his father would understand, as he'd professed horror and even some guilt over the Waco disaster. But instead, Jeff told him he was now disowned by the family, an emotional outcast, a shunned non-believer.
But Israel wasn't the only of their children struggling with their faith. Autumn Rose and two of her sisters also grappled, writing in their journals. And this is like something from a Stephen King book or something, like something from Carrie.
Yeah. In sin did my mother conceive me. I have let my conscience become seared. I would watch what I considered good movies. I started struggling with impure thoughts and sin. I started listening to contemporary Christian music. I became utterly condemned. I am wicked, a leper, a burden, forsaken, plagued, and unquestionably going to hell. Rid me of this dark unrest.
Can you imagine being raised in a family so religiously strict that you believe listening to contemporary Christian music and watching a movie is a condemnable offense? Like you're going to burn in a pit of fire for eternity just for listening to contemporary Christian music?
Yeah. Have you read, a small side note, have you read American Rapture by C.J. Lead?
No, I don't think I have.
You need to read it. I just finished it. It's phenomenal.
Yeah?
I think, oh yeah, you need to read it. And
Is it like this vibe?
Well, it definitely goes with the concept of very, very strict. Do you not know the concept of the book? I feel like you would love it.
No, I don't think I do.
So it's essentially like kind of like a zombie apocalypse in a way. It's more of like a pandemic, like there's a contagious disease being passed along and it's spread through sexual contact. So the disease is making people act out in sexual ways to propagate the spreading of the disease. So it's basically like sex zombies. And the book is told through the eyes of a protagonist who's from a deeply religious household. So her trying to make sense. So she's not only coming to terms with like her own sexual awakening because she's 16, but with like seeing the world outside of her incredibly religious upbringing while also dealing with like wild sex zombies. It's crazy. It's very good.
Oh, I'm definitely gonna check it out. You had me at sex zombies.
Yeah, I figured. Come on now. So Jeff and Heidi decide there was just too much temptation there in Washington, and they pack up the family and move to Oregon.
You know, after all those years of building that house, 7 fucking years it took them, they just leave everything behind.
Izzy stayed behind a month. It's not clear if this was because of his outcast status, the proverbial prodigal son, or if he was given the responsibility to tie up whatever loose ends were left behind.
But a month later, 17-year-old Izzy drove his pickup truck to the tiny town of Maupin, Oregon, to join back up with his family, who were all living in tents again while Jeff built a new house. But this house wasn't even for them to live in. This one was just to sell.
Izzy, who by now was well over 6 feet tall and strong as an ox, helped his father with construction, learning the layout of the land, how the Deschutes River twisted through, attracting rafters, fishermen, and nature enthusiasts. At this point, the dark fantasies of Israel Keyes, this disturbing monster morphing inside of him, grew to the point of absolute obsession, and he decided to try to commit his first murder.
Chapter 4. Leah. Israel began to stalk the recreational areas of the river, the little beaches where people would gather and picnic, hiding and watching, cache of ropes, knives, and gags hidden away. Having hidden caches of weapons and bindings, what he called kill kits, became an obsession for him. There's probably still kill kits he buried out there to this day.
One afternoon, just as dusk was falling and the sky was growing dark, the rafters all going home as the sun waned, Israel spotted a group of teenagers walking along, dragging their inner tubes, one girl lagging behind all her friends, and he pounced from the shadows.
As he himself would later say,
I just jumped out of the bushes and grabbed her, dragged her to a small bathroom. There wasn't running water or anything. They probably only cleaned it out maybe once a year. Like those ones you see at Forest Service campgrounds with the big concrete tank under them. That's why I picked it. I was waiting for someone who was pretty small, because I was gonna dump them down in the tank. It was a really dark tank. They probably wouldn't have been found for a year or something.
Israel lay the girl down on her stomach across the closed outhouse lids and began to bind her. He says the ropes had become integral to the sexual fantasy at this point. He tied her arms out so that she couldn't move, then looped the length of rope around her neck and to the handicap handbars.
Israel Keyes then sexually assaulted the girl, but he couldn't bring himself to murder her, though he deeply wanted to. She was too compliant, and he kept seeing her as a living person and not just a sexual object there simply for his amusement and pleasure.
As he himself would later say,
I think maybe she had had something like that happen. It seemed like she knew what to say and stuff. Like everybody else I took always seemed completely surprised. Like they didn't expect it. Like they had never even thought of a scenario like what they were in. She told me I was a good-looking guy who didn't need to be doing this, and that she would have gone out with me, and that what I was doing wasn't a big deal. I could just let her go and she'd never tell anyone. I mean, she was scared, but in a lot of ways, I think she was more calm about it than I was. I kept telling her to shut up, and she wouldn't. She wouldn't. So I guess I kind of changed my mind. I just lost my nerve right at the end.
Firefly, how short is life? I dreamt we had more than 20. I have seen this before, and I
Israel let her go, and she even told him her name, Leah.
Somehow, this girl had been able to show herself to be a real human being and display a lack of fear. Fear is what powers a sadist, inflicting fear and terror, that look in the eyes, the panic, the pain it creates.
Israel said he untied her, bruises already blooming up on her wrists, took her to the river, put her upon her inner tube, and pushed her out into the current.
I know pain, let them have me if I'm ready. All them skies know our names. When it's time, burn me steady.
And the event caused a crashing wave of anxiety and paranoia. He was sure he was going to be caught at any moment. As he said,
I don't remember if I was worried about DNA, but I was convinced that there was like some big investigation trying to figure out who had done this, when in reality, maybe she never even told anybody.
he'd comb the local papers, always waiting for the authorities to burst through the door at any time, and the entire time chastising himself for not having killed her. He should have killed her. He'd long regret not having killed that girl, vowing to himself the next time he got an opportunity like that, he would definitely kill.
Chapter 5, Gone Amish. The Keyes family only lasted a year in Oregon before they decided to pack it up and move all the way across the country to Malone, New York, where they bought 10 acres by the Canadian border with a little farmhouse on it, intending to farm. It appears Jeff had forgiven Israel's questioning of God, and in appreciation for all the hard work, he signed the deed of the property over to Izzy.
Just a year later, Jeff and Heidi moved the family to North Smyrna, Maine, and decided to join a new religious community, the Amish.
Yes, Jeff and Heidi decided to join the Amish and make honey. But Israel Keyes said he thought the Amish were just plain silly.
And that's the actual word he used, too. Silly. Them Amish are silly.
For Izzy, this was finally too much. All of this. What he called the, quote, cult shopping, end quote, his parents did, dragging them through Mormonism to Christian fundamentalism to crazy white people with guns, and now to the Amish.
He kept thinking about his girlfriend back in Washington, continuing to write to her. As he'd say,
I'd think to myself, what's wrong with you? Can't you give her up? No. I guess I couldn't.
So Izzy returned to the 10 acres in New York, his own land that he held the deed to. He was happy there, alone in the woods with his sick thoughts. He hunted and roamed the forest, reveling in being completely alone, stalking the grounds, dreaming of what he might do to another human being if he ever came across one.
He had 9 brothers and sisters, but he says that no one ever truly knew him. It's so spooky. He took a few courses at the community college and got his GED.
And with his GED, he was ready for his next phase of open rebellion. His survivalist, fundamentalist parents hated the government, thought it was literally evil, a symbol of Babylon and the beast. So Izzy decided to join the military and literally fight for the government, what his parents considered the devil incarnate.
And somehow, in 1998, it was possible to join the United States Army without either a social security number or a birth certificate. Crazy. All he needed was that GED. As he'd later say, I didn't exist on paper. Really.
Chapter 6. The Army. Keyes was put in the Army's 25th Infantry Division and stationed at Fort Hood in Texas. He was a good soldier, already skilled with weapons and an excellent shot, more than ready to kill.
It was here that Izzy would learn of the outside world, about modern culture, music, society, entertainment, everything, for the first time. It's wild to think about, but he'd grown up so secluded and sheltered, he didn't even know what football was. He'd never watched television, been to the movies, didn't know who Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie were, had never heard Nirvana, never even listened to the radio.
Also never drank alcohol or tried drugs.
When fellow soldiers would ask him how he could not know anything about pop culture, he'd just tell them he was Amish. To one superior, he said his parents were, quote, nomadic hippies who moved from cult to cult.
He began experimenting with drugs. He dropped acid twice, but it didn't really do anything for him. But he loved cocaine. At one point, he was snorting a gram of coke every day. But he says when he started to feel out of control, he just quit right then, cold turkey.
Most of all, he loved alcohol, which loosened him up and relaxed him, eased his social anxiety, and made it easier to talk. He was described as a super soldier who even built his own ghillie suit.
Which was seen as wild because he was part of the mortars. Even though he was in the infantry, he was in the mortar division, not the rifle division, who would use those crazy suits. But he's set to learning everything he could about American culture, studying football, learning all the players' names. And he went to his first rock concert, the Red Hot Chili Peppers and Stone Temple Pilots at Seattle's Key Arena. And guess what his favorite band was? The Insane Clown Posse. Whoop whoop. Yes, Israel Keyes was a juggalo and hung ICP posters all about his barracks.
He was still writing to his girlfriend in Washington, asking her to marry him, and she accepted, swearing her love to him, promising to stay a virgin until their wedding day. He promising the same thing, though he was a rapist who'd lost his virginity long ago.
He was made a mortar specialist in Alpha Company, 1st Battalion, 5th Infantry, and sent to Egypt for 6 months, where he'd pass the time by putting 2 scorpions in an ammo can and watching them fight to the death. He was right on the border with Israel and would go there often. One night, he and a few other guys rented a hotel suite and hired a prostitute. Keyes went in the back room with her, and a half hour later, she came flying out, Keyes behind her, asking her to take some cash, but she wouldn't and stormed out. When the other guys asked what he'd done to freak her out so bad, he just said,
Nothing. I just threw her around a little bit. I wasn't going to let her run the show.
He dated a girl in Tel Aviv, a Norwegian exchange student, whom he raped in her dorm room, later saying,
That's when I realized that if I was going to do that kind of stuff, it had to be just complete strangers from then on.
Izzy manned mortars, handled automatic weapons, and located and neutralized landmines.
He was eventually shipped back to the United States. He got arrested for drinking and driving on post by the military police, receiving a 1-day jail sentence and a $350 fine.
Paradoxically, around the same time, he was also awarded an Army Achievement Medal for meritorious service.
By this time, he was seen as very strange and possibly a sociopath by most of his unit. But he did have one close friend named Perkins, who he said was like him. They'd have long talks about how to rob banks and get away with it.
Later, when the FBI would find this guy Perkins and ask him if he was surprised that his friend Israel Keyes had become a serial killer and bank robber, he said no. He was just surprised he got caught. He was smarter than that.
Chapter 7. Tammy. It was now the year 2000, and Israel was all about the internet, watching porn and cruising for cybersex on the web, hooking up with both men and women, though he kept his bisexuality a secret, when he met a woman named Tammy through a telephone dating service.
Israel was now posted on a tiny army base in Nia Bay, Washington, and Tammy lived on the nearby Indian reservation. Though she was 10 years older than Israel and had an 8-year-old son from a previous marriage, Israel was attracted to Tammy for a few reasons. She was just very down-to-earth and sweet, very accepting, and she was gorgeous, very voluptuous. And she was half Native American and half African American.
This seems more open rebellion against his racist parents, who had raised him to believe only whites with pure European blood were the chosen people of God, and all other races were an abomination, literally the spawn of the devil. It would be a nightmare for them to know he was living in sin with a black Indian.
But Israel and Tammy had much in common. Tammy, too, had grown up without plumbing and electricity. She knew about deprivation and being the poor, outcast kid. She also knew about finding comfort and solace in nature. They both loved horror movies and heavy metal, and they both also loved getting drunk and having sex, as Tammy would later tell the FBI.
Israel Keyes is the best lover I have ever had, hands down.
Israel never told her that he'd been raised by white supremacists. She had no idea. The only glimpse she got of this was one night when they were watching television, and they showed a clip of the Kehoe brothers, Cheyenne and Chevy, shooting it out with the cops and getting away. This dash cam footage was being played everywhere at the time. You can actually still see it around on Reels and TikTok. Some crazy shit.
When the footage of his childhood friends engaged in a firefight with police came on the television, Izzy suddenly popped up and said, "I know those guys. I grew up with them."
Tammy was like, "What? You knew these white supremacist murderers growing up? What, were they part of your church or something?"
Israel just shrugged and changed the subject. Tammy knew not to force people to talk about a past they were trying to escape and let it go.
For 2 months, they were inseparable. But then she became pregnant. Tammy calling Israel at the army base to tell him the news. But Izzy told her he wasn't ready to have a family, that it was too much, too soon. He told her she should have an abortion, and she told him no. She was keeping the child, whether he liked it or not. And the couple broke up.
So, in November of 2000, Izzy takes off to Washington, where he meets up with his pure and wholesome virgin girlfriend of pure Aryan blood, who believes in Jesus and white supremacy, and gives her an engagement ring, making it official, and wedding plans were started for a ceremony in August.
But then Izzy starts acting all weird. His fiancée came and visited him when he was stationed in Fort Lewis, and he told her she was not to talk to any of his army friends at all. Not a word. She would call the barracks and he wouldn't take the call, though she knew he was there, his commanding officer telling her so. And then one night, he called her up completely shit-faced and told her the truth, that she didn't know who he was, that he was not a virgin, and that he no longer believed in God. And the wedding was called off.
And then Izzy decided maybe Tammy getting pregnant was a good thing after all. They had such an open and honest relationship. She was so easy to be with and down to earth, and beautiful as well. And he liked little kids, thought they were fun, thought he'd be a good dad. Imagine Jeff and Heidi finding out their first grandchild was quarter Native American and a quarter black.
So in July 2001, Izzy was honorably discharged from the Army and moved on to the Indian reservation with his pregnant girlfriend, Tammy. If he didn't end up to be a ruthless serial killer, this is almost like a cute little romantic comedy or a heartfelt drama. Tammy gets him a job with the Parks and Recreation, who take the outsider in, slowly learning to accept the only white guy living on this Indian reservation.
I'm aware of the bonds that were created today. When you told me that sure there's a way, the water's so still and my pain has gone away. The air is much cleaner after it rains. Follow my love, a sentence in spring air.
Izzy spends months refurbishing the little house they live in, impressing the community. He becomes a father to Tammy's young son from a previous marriage, by all reports being sensitive and kind, the boy coming to deeply love him.
But Izzy's drinking started getting out of control. He got to the point where he was drinking a bottle of wine, a fifth of whiskey, and a six-pack of beer every single night. He'd get blacked out drunk and then whisper to Tammy,
I'm a bad person. I have a black heart.
Izzy's mother, Heidi, would call the house and just recite Bible passages, say she never wanted to meet Tammy, the impure harlot he was living in sin with.
His open rebellion against religion began to manifest itself physically. He branded an inverted cross into his chest and got a pentagram tattooed on the back of his neck.
Israel would later say he was trying to understand himself, looking for the reason that he enjoyed hurting animals and people, and afterwards never feeling any guilt or shame. And he figured it must be because he was in league with the devil, and he began to study Satanism. But as we've gone over many, many times, Satanists don't torture animals or murder and rape people. And Izzy came to the obvious realization that you couldn't believe in a literal devil without believing in a literal God, and that the evil that he was something else entirely.
Eventually, he says he just accepted that he may never know why he was like he was, but that he was going to dedicate his life to that rush of power he felt during moments of sadism and sexual savagery.
Chapter 8. A Birth and a Death. Halloween night, October 31st, 2002, Tammy and Israel's daughter, Heather, was born.
Tammy insisted she give birth in a hospital, though Keyes said he'd birthed enough lambs to easily deliver the baby, that his father had delivered all 10 of his children.
Tammy said that Keyes was incredibly supportive during the birth, very attentive, and that when their daughter was born, everything about him instantly changed for the better. And she was right. He would be a good, attentive father who actually cherished his little girl.
Just 2 weeks later, Israel's father, Jeff, died.
Jeff and Heidi had been moving yet again, this time to Indiana, and were on the train as, get this, now that they were Amish, they couldn't fly or drive.
They were dressed what is called, quote, plain by the Amish people. Heidi in a long dress, her hair in a bun and covered with a white prayer cloth. Jeff in a broad-brimmed black hat, broad fall pants held up with suspenders, a long beard but his upper lip shaved, as having a mustache is sinful, a symbol of pride.
Mustached people are such show-offs. On the train, Jeff began to get sick. He long suffered from a thyroid disorder, but he refused to take any medicine or to even see a doctor, saying that would be against God's will.
Jeff grew so sick on the train that staff told him he had to get off and go to a hospital, that Amtrak weren't going to be responsible for him dying on their train. So Jeff and Heidi were literally kicked off the train.
And apparently, Jeff died somewhere, and his body was taken back to Maine. But there is no record of his death. No coroner report, no obituary, no death certificate, nothing. And no one in the family will talk about it. They have this weird wall of silence. We just know that Israel flew to Maine for the funeral because Tammy told the FBI that. But there's no record of even a funeral.
The whole thing is both wacky as hell and weird and mysterious. He was probably buried in some Amish graveyard.
Back on the reservation, Israel Keyes was a devoted and loving new father who changed Heather's diapers, would cook and clean. When Tammy started back to work at the reservation's education department, Izzy made Heather breakfast in the mornings and drove her to daycare so that Tammy could get an extra half hour of sleep.
I count my blessings, I count you first.
Then things took a dramatically bad turn. Tammy was diagnosed with ovarian cancer and had to get a hysterectomy. She was prescribed opiates for the pain and found she really liked them a lot, and became strung out.
Another victim of the dreaded OxyContin plague that devastated generations while making pharmaceutical companies billions.
Tammy slid into opium addiction. She crashed her car high and was sentenced to 25 days in jail and 2 months of rehab, and Israel took their daughter and moved out, though he stayed on the reservation where he'd been accepted.
Then Israel started hitting the dating websites and met Kimberly Anderson, a traveling nurse for remote oil production facilities, living in Port Angeles, about 2 hours away. Kimberly was sophisticated, well-traveled, and worldly, financially independent. And this relationship would also be another act of rebellion. While he was raised to believe modern medicine went against God's true ways, he was hooking up with a healthcare provider.
Izzy and Kimberly hit it off, and on March 21st, 2007, the couple decided to pack it up and move to Alaska together. They both wanted a new start, and the rugged wilderness of Alaska seemed perfect, a place many moved to for a fresh beginning.
But while Kimberly settled into their new house in Anchorage, Israel then took 3 months to roam the country a bit. He drove down through Washington and Oregon into California, working construction in Oakland, San Diego, Anaheim, Los Angeles. He crossed over into Mexico for a while, then stayed in San Ysidro, frequently visiting Tijuana. Just what exactly he was doing during this time is a mystery, as is so much about Israel Keyes.
Keyes then went to Anchorage, Alaska, and began his life with Kimberly. They lived in a nice neighborhood down a dead-end road, filled with cops and lawyers. Izzy got his contractor license and, fully bonded and insured, started his own construction business called Keyes Construction.
Under different pretenses, sometimes for medical reasons, sometimes for work, Keyes would often travel. He got dental work done in San Diego, and also had gastric band surgery, which didn't make much sense as he wasn't overweight at all. In Tijuana, he underwent rhinoplasty, making his large nose much smaller. And many wonder if he was altering his body on a quest to become the perfect serial killer, which makes total sense to me. He most likely got the gastric band not as a means of losing weight, but so he wouldn't get hungry and could therefore have more time to stalk his prey, going days without eating.
The plastic surgery was an attempt to become more nondescript. His large nose was his most prominent feature, the one that made him stand out. He had no social security number, no birth certificate, and now he'd altered his face, becoming a shadow, a ghost, an invisible spirit of death wandering the country. Some speculate he may have even underwent surgery to remove sweat glands so he wouldn't leave behind DNA.
Traveled far and wide. Oregon, California, Wyoming, Utah, New York, Maine, Indiana, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Vermont, Texas, Louisiana, Alabama, Florida, Ohio, Minnesota, Arizona, North Dakota, Oklahoma, Nevada, Colorado, New Mexico, Kansas, Illinois, and Hawaii, while also venturing into Canada as well.
Because the FBI had found an extensive list of phone numbers on him, we know he hired sex workers in nearly all these places, some of whom were transgender, and he practiced his bondage skills on them, mastering techniques of tying a person up and incapacitating them, the ropes and knots all part of the sexual thrill.
There's just so much we don't know about what Keyes did during these trips, though there's much speculation. Speculation that we will eventually go over in detail. But we do know for a fact that on April 21st, 2009, Israel Keyes robbed a bank in Tupper Lake, New York, and that he buried the cash as well as weapons and other murder accessories in 5-gallon containers, what he called his kill kits, that he was leaving strategically across the country.
We know that on June 2nd, 2011, Israel Keyes boarded a plane in Anchorage, Alaska, flew to Seattle, and from there took another flight to Chicago, where he rented a car and then drove 1,000 miles to New York, visiting his little farmhouse, then drove to Vermont, where he disabled his cell phone by taking the battery out, then went to the forest and dug up one of the kill kits he'd buried after the bank robbery in New York 2 years earlier.
The kit contains zip ties, ammunition, a .22 pistol, a homemade silencer, duct tape, and Drano he planned to use to, quote, accelerate human decomposition. Israel
drove around the little town of Essex, Vermont, that he'd chosen at random, situating himself and getting to know the layout, coming across an abandoned farmhouse on Route 15 with a for sale sign on the overgrown lawn. As Keyes would say, "I always stop at empty houses, especially if they have for sale signs."
The house was ancient and falling apart, set far back from the main road, obscured by trees. The front door was unlocked, and Izzy walked right in. The way he described it was just how Albert Fish described the farmhouse he took little Grace Budd to. Ramshackle and falling apart, covered in mold. The doors hanging off their hinges. A hole in the roof, water leaking in, going through a hole in the floor and down to the basement, as if a cannonball had fallen through. In the bedroom was an old brass bed with a dirty mattress on it.
To Israel Keyes, this forlorn and disheveled place was perfect. Just perfect.
He rented a room at the Handy Suites, then went to the Lowe's and purchased a camping stove, then spent the day cleaning and oiling his gun, getting it into working order after having been buried for over 2 years.
When it grew dark outside, he left the hotel, dressed entirely in black, wearing batting gloves, an unlit headlamp strapped to his skull, and wandered off on foot, thinking he wanted to abduct, rape, and murder a man.
It was pouring rain, and he spotted a guy getting out of a yellow Volkswagen Bug, which was actually the same car Ted Bundy drove, which Israel would have known, as Bundy was his hero. But as Keyes went to the car to abduct him, the man suddenly leapt out with a newspaper over his head to keep the rain off and sprinted to his apartment, never knowing that death awaited there in the shadows, as Keyes would later state.
If he had been about 5 seconds slower getting out of his car, he would have been the one that night.
Undaunted, Keyes then changed his plan and decided he wanted to abduct a couple, an older couple, if possible. Walking through the rain, house to house, he finally came to 8 Colbert Street. It was after midnight, and Keyes surveilled the house, peeking in the windows, sensing that yes, an older couple lived there. Up the phone line. Then noticed a neighbor walking his dog and smoking a cigarette, so Izzy ducked into the backyard.
When the neighbor with the dog finally went home, Israel went to the garage, removed a ventilation fan from the window, and hoisted himself inside. He turned on his headlamp, took a crowbar he found hanging, and went to the kitchen door. He pried open the locked screen door and found the main door deadbolted, so he just busted out the glass, reached in, and undid the bolt.
Once inside the house, he shot down the hallway and entered the bedroom for what he called a blitz attack.
And there lay Bill and Lorraine Corrier. They were a slightly older couple, Bill 49 and Lorraine 55, both big-boned, paunchy, perhaps a bit overweight. They weren't what would traditionally be considered sexy or good-looking, like the college girls Ted Bundy stalked, not the type of people a sexually motivated serial killer would normally strike. But Israel didn't have a type. He was bisexual, so both men and women were targets. And age was no factor either. From teenagers to folks in their 50s, no one was safe around this monster.
At first, the sleeping couple didn't even really understand what was happening. They couldn't comprehend that there was a large, masked man pointing a gun at them. Keyes demanded to know if they had any weapons, and Lorraine said yes. There was a loaded .38 right there on the nightstand beside her, which Israel promptly retrieved.
Lorraine was sleeping in a t-shirt and shorts, but Israel removed some lingerie from a drawer, which he'd later demand she wear. Again, Israel would say this crime was completely sexually motivated.
Israel had the couple lay face down and bound their hands behind their backs with zip ties before ransacking the bedroom, stealing bottles of Vicodin and Percocet, grabbing 2 suitcases and stuffing them with clothes and jewelry, in what appears to be an attempt to make it appear to law enforcement that the couple had actually left the house on their own.
Israel came across some military insignia and told Bill that he too had been in the Army's 25th Infantry Division, allowing Bill to think this may make them buddies of sorts, telling them it was just a kidnapping for ransom money.
He led them out of the house, careful no one cut their feet on the broken glass by the kitchen door, not wanting to leave a DNA trail. He put them into their car, a green 4-door Saturn, seat-belted them in, put the ventilation fan back in the window of the garage, and hung the crowbar back where he had found it.
Then, assuring them this was a simple kidnapping for ransom that would soon be over, Israel Keyes drove Bill and Lorraine Corrier out into the night, onto Route 15 into the abandoned farmhouse he'd staked out earlier.
He marched Bill through the basement door, tying him to a stool with a combination of ropes and zip ties. When he went back to the car to get Lorraine, he found her in the driveway attempting to escape, running down towards Route 15. He tackled her and dragged her to the decrepit farmhouse, pushing her up the stairs and into the bedroom with the hole in the roof and floor, pushing her onto the dirty mattress and binding her arms and legs to the bed with duct tape.
He then wrapped a rope around her neck and under the mattress, tying it off with a compound knot as she fought desperately, the same exact way he'd bound the teenage rafter to the latrine back in Washington all those years ago.
Israel then prepared to torture Lorraine, taking out the camping stove, lighting it, putting a pan of water on it. But Bill was now screaming from the basement, "Where's my wife? Where's my wife?"
So Israel Keyes headed down to the dark basement, the only light coming from his headlamp, where he found Bill partway free, having smashed the stool to pieces. Bill pleaded with him.
"Why? Why are you doing this? You don't need to do this. Just leave. We'll never tell anyone. Just please let us go. Let us go."
Israel picked up a shovel and began to beat Bill about the head until he crumpled to the floor. Then he raced back upstairs to find that Lorraine, in her struggles, had knocked the propane stove over and it had fallen through the hole in the floor.
Panicking, thinking that the camping stove was going to set the house on fire, he ran back down the stairs and found the camping stove in the living room.
Things were going out of control. This wasn't how he'd planned it. They were fighting back too hard.
He'd planned on raping and torturing Bill. He'd specifically wanted a man, then an older couple. But handling the two of them was proving too much. So he simply took his .22 pistol, a very quiet gun with a silencer attached, went back to the basement where he found Bill back on his feet again, now yelling at the top of his lungs.
Israel unloaded the .22 on him, shooting him in the arms, head, neck, and chest, firing and firing and firing until he was out of bullets.
To Israel's amazement, Bill just stood there, defiantly refusing to fall. But then, after a moment, he toppled over dead.
To calm himself down after all the mayhem, Israel went outside and smoked a cigar, surveying the neighborhood, hoping no one had heard the gunshots or the screams. All was quiet and peaceful, only the sound of the rain falling down from a black sky.
Keyes then went back into the old farmhouse, stomped upstairs, began to boil water on the cook stove, then commenced torturing and sexually assaulting Lorraine for hours. And though he would later give the FBI a detailed account of exactly what he did with this pan of boiling water, they have never released exactly what it was.
When Keyes was finished, he untied Lorraine, took her downstairs, and revealed her dead husband to her, surprised by how much blood had leaked from the large man, thinking it was sloppy as DNA was now everywhere.
Keyes then slipped the rope around Lorraine's neck and from behind strangled her to death.
In order to ensure she was dead, he cinched a zip tie around her neck as tightly as possible and left it there embedded in her flesh.
He then poured Drano over their hands and faces, put their bodies in large 55-gallon trash bags, and rolled the remains into a corner where he piled garbage and wood on top of them.
His plan had been to burn the house down, but the sun was now rising, commuters traveling Route 15 on their way to work, so he just left. In such a hurry, he sloppily left his shell casings on the basement floor.
He assumed whomever bought the house would just tear it down and wouldn't wish to seek out the source of the horrible smell in the basement, thinking they would assume it to be an animal that had somehow wandered in. And he was absolutely right.
He drove their green Saturn to a Rite Aid parking lot where he'd left his rental car the night before, parking as far from security cameras as he could. Then walked head down with his hood up to his rental car, got in and calmly drove up and out of Vermont into the state of Maine, moving like a ghost in the night, leaving the crime scene far behind.
And that, ladies and gentlemen, is where we leave you today. But we will be back next week with more of the horrible and bizarre story of serial killer Israel Keys.
Thanks so much for listening.
And I want to give a huge shout out and heartfelt thank you to all the wonderful musicians and bands that donated music to today's show. The darkly beautiful and soulful sounds of Witch Gaze with their song I'll Show You, which I really loved. Thank you, Witch Gaze. The horror rockabilly of Shriek If You Know What I Did Last Friday the 13th with their song Necro Cannibal. Thank you so much, Shriek If You Know What I Did Last Friday the 13th. I just fucking love horror rockabilly. Very stoked to have those guys on. The song Every Time by Katie Kirby and Brother John and Highway Fever by Halizna. Total show favorite. Love Halizna. There are links to all their music in the show notes. Please check them out. And do you have a band you'd like featured? Or did we maybe get something wrong? Do you have a case you'd like us to cover? Reach out to us at murdercoasterpodcast@gmail.com. That's murdercoasterpodcast@gmail.com. Thank you all so much for listening. We will see you next week for part 2 of Israel Keys.